Good morning, Joao.
Good morning, Dr. Dime. How are you?
Good. Wow. Where is that library, or is that just a background?
That's just the background.
All right. So we'll start in about 3 or 4 minutes,
Okay, sounds good.
and it's already been recorded. So let me
Perfect.
make sure that you can get this and share your slides.
Mhm. How have you been?
Well, at home. And have you been going to the plant at all?
No, last time I was in the office was middle of March. And then after that, it's been home. Yeah, it's a completely different world now, I guess.
Well, yeah. At least a meteor did not hit us, so that would have been
Yeah,
close.
yeah. Let's look at it through that
Exactly.
perspective.
Yeah.
How are the classes at PSU? Is everything going good with Zoom and everything?
Well, I mean, I'm basically experimenting with this class now with some asynchronous elements because we did summer road mapping, and
Okay.
it was good. We had 40 people, but 5 to 6 hours in front of a basic computer. It wasn't so. It was painful at times. So,
Mm-hmm.
so we're looking at the innovative ideas really, because like this said, this is not going to change anytime soon.
Yeah. Is this
Okay.
is this 520?
Yeah,
Okay.
and also some from technology assessment because of what we did. So
Okay.
okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. So why don't you introduce yourself as well, what you did and where you are now, and we're very delighted to have you here, Dr. Lavoie.
Sure. Let me just try to share my screen here. No, it's saying that I won't be able to share my screen until I quit the application. So let me just try this real quick. I'll be back in a few seconds.
Okay.
Okay, let's try this again. Seems like it's going to work now.
Yeah, it's working.
Perfect.
Excellent.
Okay.
Go ahead. And then don't forget to introduce yourself.
Will do. Sounds good. So, hey, everyone. My name is Joao Lavoie. I'm a former member of Dr. Dime's research group. Very proud of that. And today I'm going to be walking you through my dissertation slide deck. And rather, I would like to take you through my PhD journey. So before I just talk a little bit about myself, the title of my dissertation was A Scoring Model to Assess Organizations' Technology Transfer Capabilities, the case of a power utility in the Northwest USA. So a little bit about me. So in terms of educational background, I have a bachelor's degree in industrial engineering. Finished that one in 2008. And then I came to Portland in late 2014 to study with Dr. Dime, like I said. And in 2019, I received a double degree, a master's of engineering in engineering management, and also a PhD in technology management. Throughout that whole time from 2014 to middle of 2018, I was part of Dr. Dime's research group, working with Bonneville Power Administration in a slew of different technology management projects. It was a very fruitful and good experience for me. Very grateful for Dr. Dime's opportunity. In terms of professional experience, I've had some previous industrial engineering experience back in Brazil, where I came from. And like I said, I've been a research assistant throughout practically my whole PhD journey at PSU, working with BPA. And most recently, from the middle of 2018 on, I've been working at Daimler Trucks North America in the platform strategy group. I should also say that, as Dr. Dime knows very well, I was born and raised in Brazil, so I'm a big soccer fan. And I'm proud to say that my national team has won 5 World Cups, while Germany has only won 4 so far, Dr. Dime. So we're still ahead at this point.
Well, do you remember the game in 2014, I guess?
I was concerned you were going to bring that up, but let's talk about this offline. All right. So the agenda for you guys today, like I said, my intention is through the introduction to take you through my PhD journey, most specifically the literature review, which is the very initial stage of the research, then the gap analysis, a little bit of the methodology and the approach that we used, the research model, how it was to reach out to the experts and create the initial model, validate it, quantify it, and so on. And then the application of the research at BPA on this case. And to finalize, we're going to talk a little bit of the conclusions that I derived and some of the implications of my research. I do have some time for Q&A at the end, Dr. Dime. Please feel free to stop me at any time if you have questions. It's not a problem. So again, the very first question I had in my head when I started thinking about technology transfer as a dissertation topic was, what is technology transfer after all? What are the definitions that are out there? So one of the things that I noticed as I dove deep into the body of knowledge was that technology transfer is not a new research topic at all. Researchers have been developing their time to this since the mid to late 70s at least. So there's a lot of research out there. And the most impressive thing to me is that there was not one unique or consensual definition around what technology transfer would be. One of the things that you can notice is that tech transfer is indeed very complex, and it is a multidisciplinary topic that involves several different perspectives. Throughout those 40 and some years that researchers have been researching tech transfer, you can see a variety of different trends in the body of knowledge. And the latest of those trends was the inception of the concept of commercialization into the tech transfer research. So that commercialization can be looked at from 2 different sides, either from taking a technology from the very basic research stage, bringing it all the way to the market, or just transferring a technology development cycle from a research center or a university lab, for example, to the industry, which will then take that technology as input to their own new product development processes. So that was the latest development in the body of knowledge. And back to my initial point, I didn't find at least a satisfactory and unique definition for tech transfer. So I decided, for the purposes of my research, to come up with one myself. And that's the one that you can see at the bottom of the slide here. So to me, tech transfer would be the movement of knowledge or physical items and knowledge to be used, further developed, or commercialized by another set of people, either in the same or in different organizations. The other very important and interesting point in the body of knowledge is that you can clearly see 2 very distinct schools of thought in the ways that researchers look at tech transfer as a topic. So I'm trying to describe these 2 schools here within those 2 boxes. On the left-hand side, you see one school of thought that looks at and deals with tech transfer as a one-time event only. So for those folks, for those scholars, tech transfer should be dealt with only after the whole technology development cycle is absolutely done. You shouldn't be thinking or doing anything about tech transfer before that point. For them, tech transfer should be done on a case-by-case basis. So you should not have any standardized processes or practices in place at all. And their argument is that if you do that, you would have a more efficient approach and a more flexible approach. So you're able to adapt to every single technology characteristic that you're dealing with, and you're not spending too much time and resources on it. On the other hand, there's a completely different view to tech transfer, which sees it as a continuous process. So for those scholars, tech transfer should be running absolutely in parallel with the whole technology development cycle. In fact, some of them say that you should be thinking about tech transfer even before the technology development starts as an input into whether or not you should invest in such a technology. For those folks, if you do that, they argue that you will have a more effective approach and you're likely to have a better strategic alignment or strategic adherence throughout the whole process. So I should say that, again, for the purposes of my research, and I think that's in alignment with the ETM department, we look at tech transfer as more of a continuous process rather than a one-time event only. So the second step for me was, okay, now I know what tech transfer is. So the second question was, why is it important? And why should technology managers even spend time on it or occupy themselves with it? So as I was reading and learning about the topic, I could clearly see three main reasons why tech transfer is important. The first one is, we know that in such a dynamic and globalized economy that we live in today, innovation is very crucial to differentiate yourself from your competitors. And in order to achieve innovation, you have to do research and development. You have to develop new products and new services and new technologies. So in order to do that, research and development became this huge field that is absolutely important. And everybody agrees in the body of knowledge that tech transfer management is an inherent part of R&D management. So they also say that any organization that has good tech transfer capabilities is likely to be ahead of their competitors in terms of R&D management and in terms of innovation. So that's the first argument why tech transfer would be important. The second one relates to what we call the valley of death. So this valley of death concept is specifically important for technology push innovations, where the innovators are trying to invent a need in the market. It's not something that comes explicitly out of the market. So we say that there is a gap between the technology development cycle and the actual product development cycle, and that gap is called valley of death in the literature. Furthermore, we have not only anecdotal data, but also very strong hard data to say that the vast majority of technologies fail before they hit the market. So most of those technology development cycles don't succeed. And there is a consensus in the body of knowledge as well that the more technology transfer efforts are in place, the easier it would be for you to overcome that valley of death or to avoid that valley of death. But here's another important point to mention. This important topic for tech transfer is only valid if you look at that topic as a continuous process and not as a one-time event only. So at the end of the day, tech transfer as a continuous process can help to incur positive outcomes on your R&D activities. The third and last argument towards proving that technology transfer is important relates to the strategic alignment. So if you look at that first bullet point here, I don't think anybody would question that. It's very important to align your corporate strategy or your business applications and the R&D activities you're going through. Of course, I usually use a very silly example to talk about this. For example, if you work for, I don't know, a motorcycle company, you're unlikely to invest in a new machine that produces ice cream. Because of course, ice cream and motorcycles have nothing to do with one another. Well, that's a silly example, but if you think about the very fuzzy front end of technology development, some of those technologies take years, 5, 10 years to develop. And throughout the technology development cycle, a lot can happen and a lot can change. So if you do not have a process that is constantly checking the strategic alignment between what you're trying to achieve and what your company stands for, you're likely to not have any good strategic alignment. At some point, you're likely to question why you're even spending time and money on that project after all. So in terms of the most widely accepted and used technology development processes and tools, technology road mapping is by far the most widely accepted in order to create that strategic alignment. However, there's a problem. Road mapping is really good to ensure that alignment at the very beginning of the process, when you're starting to develop your technology, when you're selecting your projects. However, again, if you start a very long an arduous technology development project, you're likely to lose that strategic alignment over time. So a continuous tech transfer project would provide you with those checkpoints to try and keep that adherence throughout the whole cycle. So with all that in mind, I was going through the literature and trying to figure out which problems I could try to solve with my research. And I was able to pinpoint 4 different gaps that I was trying to address. And I'll quickly go through each one of those here. The first one is I noticed that although there is a variety of research topics within tech transfer in the literature, there's really not a holistic and quantitative enough framework that depicts what a good and adequate complete technology transfer process would look like. What you can observe is a lot of bits and pieces of important aspects, important factors, important perspectives, but nothing really bringing the bigger picture together. So to the point that some research was arguing that technology transfer is still not completely understood after all those years of research. So that was my gap number 1. I was trying to kind of put some order and create a model that would adequately and comprehensively depict the tech transfer process. The second gap derives directly from the first one, and the logic is the following. If you do not have something that depicts the situation, you're unlikely to measure your capabilities in that situation. So again, you don't have a model to tell you what the capabilities would be for tech transfer. So how can you gauge how well or how poorly you're doing it? There's no such a thing. So I was also trying to tackle that, to create a model that would be useful for practitioners to tell their weaknesses and their strengths when it comes to tech transfer. The third one is a more strict gap. So there's a slew of different typologies in the tech transfer body of knowledge. The vast majority of research is occupied with what we call external tech transfer. That is when you're transferring technologies between 2 different and separate legal entities. However, as we know, it is true that the vast majority of large corporations also do internal technology transfer. So that is, for example, your R&D department is developing their technologies, and at some point they need to transfer that into your series engineering department. That process is also technology transfer, but it's happening internally within one legal entity. So there was also an explicit claim from scholars that we should devote ourselves more to understand and improve those internal tech transfer capabilities. So that's another aspect that I was trying to tackle with my research. And finally, the last gap I was trying to address was, again, in relationship to the strategic alignment. Although there was a lot of claims that a continuous tech transfer process and improved tech transfer capabilities would help with that strategic adherence, there was little to no real evidence or case studies that would prove that. So I was also trying throughout my study to prove to some extent that tech transfer could help with that strategic alignment. So this is a quick summary of everything that we discussed so far. So on the left-hand side, you have all the 4 research gaps that I quickly discussed. Those would funnel down into my main research goal, which was to develop a tech transfer score to measure an organization's internal tech transfer capabilities. And stemming out of that goal, I had 5 very specific research questions that I was trying to tackle. Not going to go through all of them here, but it would range from what would be the criteria and the sub-criteria or factors that should be in such a model in order to properly assess tech transfer capabilities, all the way down to the question of whether such a model will be generalizable enough to be applied in a wide variety of sectors and applications, or if we would have to come up with one specific model for each sector or industry. All right, so next up is the methodological approach that I used. So I will be talking about how I did this in a few slides, but in a nutshell, what I did was I used a methodological approach called action research to help and improve my actual method, which was a hierarchical decision modeling. So before we go there, let me talk a little bit about what action research is, because there's a lot of talk out there and sometimes a lot of misconception as to what action research really is. So it's really a method, as I'm saying here, to create knowledge, and it's a learning by doing method. It's a method where the actual researcher rolls up his or her sleeves and actually participates in the action of the research. rather than on the vast majority of cases where the researcher removes him or herself from the situation and just observes and reports on what he or she is learning. Action researcher, in the action, you're trying to change the status quo. So there are a myriad of different frameworks that would define what an action research cycle would look like. And here I'm bringing one of the most widely accepted and popular ones, which involves 4 steps. So the first one, creating communities of inquiry within communities of practice. What that means is the researcher really has to insert himself into the action and understand what's going on. That's the step number 1. Step number 2, building theories in practice. You not only understand what's going on, but you build theories and you create improvement plans and suggestions to change the status quo. And then the third step, you go above and beyond. You not only suggest changes, but you implement those changes and you test them out in the real world, along with the practitioners. And finally, the 4th step, you actually change the status quo and you try to understand the newly created status quo. So then you're back at the first step and it becomes a cycle. So that's what would qualify as an action research approach. One of the interesting aspects of action research is that scholars agree that it fits very well in combination with other methods that would leverage subjective experiences and opinions from experts. And that is actually an excellent segue to talk about HDM. So HDM is what we call hierarchical decision modeling. It is a multi-criteria decision-making method that was actually invented by the founding father of ETM as a department, Dr. Dunder Kukaglu. And what HDM really is you try to break down a very complex situation in a hierarchical disposition that makes sense for that problem. And each of those sections of the model or chunks of the model are smaller and easier to handle. Okay. Not only that, you put that in a hierarchical disposition and you bring the expertise of subject matter experts for each part of the model to try to better understand the situation. And it has the absolutely amazing capability of quantifying those judgments. So even when you're dealing with very subjective aspects of a problem, HDM has the capability of assigning a number behind that. So that makes it easier for you to derive insights. And at the end of the day, like I said, HDM is very good for complex and multi-criteria problems, which goes back to my definition of tech transfer. And within the technology management community is a widely recognized and very solid method. So then finally, how did I blend it all together? So traditionally, when you want to implement an HDM application, what you do is you create an initial model solely out of data from the literature review. So you only have one main source of information. You dive into the literature, you understand the problem, you understand what past researchers have done, and you create an initial hierarchical model. Then you take that model to, let's say, real-world practitioners and academicians so they can validate and quantify it. So what I did, the novelty of my methodological approach was to not only use the literature review as an input for my initial model, but I also used an action research project that we were conducting at BPA at the time as a secondary source of information. So I combined these two sources as inputs to my initial model. And then after that point, I went into what I call the research phase 2, which is just a more traditional approach of identifying experts, validating the model, quantifying, and so on and so forth. So let's talk a little bit more about the model and what it looks like. So here's what my very first initial model looked like. So you have a hierarchical disposition, a mission up there, which is again to develop the tech transfer score. I have 5 different perspectives. And within each perspective, I have several factors, totaling 21 factors. And I'm color coding here, and it's important for you to understand the factors that are within the red boxes came solely from the literature. Okay, so that will be the traditional approach. The other factors that are within the green boxes came from the action research, from experiences from practitioners. Okay, so going into my validation, I had one very big challenge in my head, which was once I present this model to the experts, they're going to be assessing it. They're going to be telling me this makes sense, this does not make sense, you're forgetting that factor, this other factor doesn't make sense, so on and so forth. At the end of that process, you come at the other end with the final and validated model that you can use to apply. Okay. And I knew that after the validation process, if most of my green boxes were rejected, I would know that my methodological approach was not very robust. On the other hand, if at the end of the validation, most, if not all of the green boxes were kept and the whole overall structure of the model was kept, I would know that my novelty and methodological approach would be acceptable and robust enough. So next step was to identify experts to participate in my study. So I employed several different techniques to find and narrow down my experts. At the end, we were able to find a pool of 39 experts, and they were ranging from different countries, different expertise, different sectors, whether from the government or industry or academia. So it was a very, very diverse group of experts that participated. And another step that I took throughout the validation process was to break down my model and not only present the whole model to the whole pool of 39 experts. I was subdividing those experts and allocating them based on their expertise, creating different profiles as I'm listing here, and allocating each one of those profiles to a very specific section of my model to maximize the association between each expert's expertise in each section of the model, and also trying to mitigate bias and decrease the level of disagreement. So after this assignment, this is what the final validated model looked like. And if you remember a couple slides back, you will notice that there are only two main differences between the initial model and the final validated model. The first one was that experts told me that I was missing one factor within the organizational culture perspective. That is the innovative culture factor in blue here that I'm adding. And the second difference is they deemed the data management factor within the technical perspective not super important, so we had to drop it. And that factor was indeed originally coming from the action research. But as you can see, at the end of the day, the whole structure of the model was kept, and the vast majority of the items coming from action research were also validated. So that not only validated my model in this specific instance, but that has also validated the whole methodological approach that I was trying to prove. So that was a very interesting part of my research. The next step was to quantify it. So according to the HDM methodology, we present the experts with pairwise comparisons and we apply the algorithms. And then at the end, we come up with the numerical representations of how important each perspective and each factor is towards the mission. And another interesting aspect back to the methodological approach here, I'm circling in red the least important factors within each perspective, and I'm circling in blue the most important factors within each perspective. And as you can see, for 2 perspectives out of 5, the most important factors were indeed coming from the action research, which further proves my theory that action research could be a very, very strong aid in improving and enhancing your initial HDM model. All right, so next step was to really apply this model. So before we talk about the results, let me just give you the brief rationale behind where we applied and why we applied that model. So we decided to apply in the energy sector for 2 major reasons. First of all, it is one of the most important industrial sectors in the country. No one disputes that it's absolutely critical for national safety and economic prosperity. It's at the very base of any industrial application for sure. And at the time, and still today, the energy sector has been undergoing major technological transformations, not only in terms of demand response and energy efficiency, but perhaps most importantly, in terms of the renewable energy sources that we're seeing. And I also decided to apply specifically to BPA, not only because we had access to them, but there were 3 main reasons why. First of all, BPA had been solidly investing in research and development. And for a while, they had a strong history of 10 to 15 years of solid investment in R&D. They were dealing with technology transfer questions and issues on a daily basis in their technology innovation office. And they were also actively looking to understand and enhance their tech transfer capabilities So the compilation of all these factors made BPA in the energy sector the perfect use case for my study. And off we went to implement this. So this is a table that brings the final numerical results of the application. Without going into the technicalities of what each of those numbers mean, what we basically did is taking the quantification results of the model itself, we added to that a concept that is called desirability functions and desirability curves to gauge the performance characteristics of BPA at that time for each individual factor in a model. And then we multiply those two values to come up with the final tech transfer score for each one of those 21 factors. And then subsequently, of course, if you sum everything up, you get the final tech transfer score of 32.10 at that specific point in time. So one thing that you can also do with this final score is to break it down into those 5 different perspectives. So for example, out of the strategic alignment perspective, the final one here, the total score, the maximum score rather, would be 24, and BPA was scoring 11.7, which puts them about halfway through that perspective. So rather than just thinking about the number itself, there are some insights and some benefits behind this model application that require some interpretation. So the first and perhaps the most important benefit of this application is the situational awareness that this model brings to the technology manager. So before applying the model, you really didn't know how poorly or how well you were performing for each one of those perspectives and factors. Now looking at those individual numbers, you have a fairly good gauge to understand your weaknesses and your strengths for each one of those model sections. What that understanding does to you in turn is that it puts you in a good position to start crafting plans to improve on your weaknesses. And you can also be aware that whatever you're doing on your strengths, you have to keep doing that. So those are the 2 main benefits of the actual application. And I think I would mention a third aspect that was personally interesting to me is to see the aspects of a maturity model that this model has as well. If you look at the final score, 32.10, it looks rather low because the maximum would be 100, of course. But again, you have to understand that in order for you to achieve 100 as a score, you have to be absolutely perfect in every single aspect of the model, which could be in a lot of ways an unattainable objective. However, you should have that unattainable objective as a North Star and as a reference to be followed, and that could also be beneficial to the organization. So I told you that one of the benefits would be to use the results to understand your strengths and weaknesses and to think about pathways to improvement. So after the application of the model, we sat down with some of the executives in the agency, and we started talking about suggestions to improve those capabilities. And this is just a simulation exercise to exemplify this point, really. So what we did here was we focused on the 5 most important factors in the model that are listed here on the left. We understood the current desirability value of BPA at that time, and we were proposing a pathway to improvement broken down into 2 waves. So just for the sake of the example here, let's take the tech transfer team and training factor. They had a desirability value of 10 at the time. And if I remember correctly, that was because their tech transfer team only had representatives from 1 department within the agency. So we were proposing as a first step, first wave, to add multiple representatives for more than 1 department, and that would take them 1 step forward. As a second wave on the same factor, in order to max out the performance in that particular factor, they would have to have representatives from all relevant departments within the agency, as well as have a formal training program for everybody that was participating in the tech transfer team and process. So what that does to you in terms of the tech transfer score is, if BPA were successful at the first wave of improvement, only in those top 5 factors again, you would have an increase in the tech transfer score from the original 32 something up to 45.5. From that point on, if they implemented a second wave of improvement, they would go up to 62.7. So again, that gives you an idea of how valuable those snapshots in time could be. You take an initial application of the model, you understand your weaknesses and your strengths. That puts you in a better position to think about pathways to improvement. You implement those strategies and tactics, you assess yourself again, and then you can analyze the delta and see where your trend is at. So that's one of the main benefits of the model. So after all that, going quickly through the conclusions here. So in terms of the methodological approach, at least from a more theoretical standpoint, it was very important to prove that HDM could be really aided by a secondary methodological approach from the get-go. And in this case, it was action research. So the validation and the quantification processes for my model has proven that action research is indeed beneficial if adequately implemented along with HDM. In terms of the validation, I was talking about earlier how we divided the expert panels into multiple different profiles and groups. And I came to the conclusion that by doing that, you have a higher likelihood of mitigating the bias and also achieving lower disagreement levels between the expert panels, which are great benefits for HDM as a method. However, the downside as a researcher is that in order to achieve that, that process will require constant interaction and back and forth between the research and the experts. So there's a lot of overhead there, but it's definitely worthwhile. And still, in terms of the quantification, again, more on the theoretical side, going into the model building, I was assuming that I would have a very heavy focus on the formality of the tech transfer funding and how formally distributed a corporate strategy was. But after going the validation and quantification process with the experts, they really did not focus so much on that. And rather, we saw a very heavy focus on the formalized tech transfer team and on having an early informal technology proposals assessment. So that was rather a surprise in my research as well. In terms of, let's say, the more practitioner-oriented benefits, so these are some of the implications and conclusions that I discussed in my dissertation. So after we apply the model, I discussed the results with the agency, and I sat down with one of their senior managers to discuss what those results really meant to them going forward. And we were in agreement with three main benefits of the whole process. So the first one was, and I think I alluded to this earlier, the model itself can serve as a reference to be followed. Again, if you remember, my very first research gap was that before my research, I really didn't have a comprehensive enough method or model that will tell you all the tech transfer capabilities that should be in place. So now the model that we built can serve as a reference to that effect. The second benefit is the model application process itself. So again, in order for you to properly apply the model, you have to gauge how well or how poorly you are doing regarding each and every one of those 21 factors. And how do you go about doing that assessment? You have to communicate within your own group. You have to communicate between different groups. You have to foster that communication, that knowledge sharing, that cooperation within the company. And throughout this whole process, this positive delta in knowledge and cooperation and communication can be seen in and of itself as a benefit, aside from the actual results of the model. And then the third and perhaps the most obvious benefit for the practitioners are the results that we already discussed. So the ability of providing situational awareness, understanding your strengths, understanding your weaknesses, and putting you in a good position to start thinking about improvement paths, implementing those paths, and reassessing yourself and doing this in a sequential manner. That will be the main benefit of the model for sure. Now, as far as what the strategies to achieve the improvement go, I really did not focus too much on those strategies in my dissertation. I would rather just discussing a few different options that a technology manager could have. The first one is based on model weights, and that's what we did throughout that simulation exercise that I ran through a few slides ago, where you, instead of looking inwards to understand your capabilities, you just look at the model, you figure out what the top 5 or top 10 factors are, and you heavily focus on those in order to maximize your tech transfer score in the smallest amount of time possible. However, we have a very opposite strategy that may be valuable as well, which is instead of focusing on the top 5 or top 10 factors in the model, you look inwards, you understand your own organization's expertise, and you might as well choose to tackle the low-hanging fruits first. So let's start with the easier topics or factors that we know we can succeed at. Let's get those out of the way. And as we learn through this improvement process, we can then be in a position of tackling higher challenges and go from there. So my overall recommendation to technology managers was for each one of them to take the time to understand what your organization's capabilities and shortcomings are in order to define and choose a strategy moving forward towards increasing and enhancing your tech transfer capabilities. Finally, I was discussing, as with any other research work, there are always limitations and future research opportunities. On my case here, I would say the biggest limitation was a methodological one, which is the inherent subject matter expert bias. So invariably, with every method that leverages subject matter experts' opinions and judgments, you're dealing with human beings, of course, and humans are inherently biased. So one thing that a researcher can do, and that's what I try to do, is to apply the best practices in the industry and in academia to try to mitigate that bias. And that's what I was talking about in terms of the expert formation and selection. So all of these listed practices here were implemented in order to mitigate the bias. And one of the metrics that we looked at was the disagreement level and the logical inconsistency levels within those expert panels, and they were acceptable. So I deemed my research to be successful in that regard. And finally, in terms of the future model application opportunities, I was discussing two potential applications that would be very exciting to me. And I hope that if somebody would take the ball from that point and do that, which is to apply the same model in other agencies or companies within the energy sector, see how these other players think about the model, if they think it's as useful as it was for BPA, and especially conducting longitudinal studies. So that's what I was alluding to in terms of taking a snapshot in time of your capabilities today, creating an improvement plan, implementing it, taking another snapshot with an evaluation of the model, and then evaluating the delta and your trends over time and doing this subsequently. So that will be a very interesting study to see. And the other question that I was raising was about the generalizability of the model. I really didn't have the opportunity to formally apply the model in other agencies or companies or other sectors, but I did talk to all of the experts that participated in this study. As I said before, they came from a wide range of expertise and backgrounds, and everybody agreed that the model as it is will be applicable basically anywhere, but I didn't have that hard data to back it up. So it would be a very interesting follow-on research to apply the model in other industries and try also to conduct inter-industry comparisons in terms of their level of capabilities. So that was all I had, Dr. Dime. I don't know if we have time for some questions and answers.
Let's see if there are any questions. Okay. Anyone?
Dr. Dime, I've got a question, of course.
Yes, please.
Well, it's not so much a question, but a comment. It seems to me that at the beginning you posed which one's better, one-time event for technology transfer or a continuous process for technology transfer. And right. The whole paper basically says continuous process is great. Did I get that right?
Right.
Okay. Yeah. And then, so by way of a comment in terms of experience myself, this is what I've seen when we were doing internal technology transfer where, such experts were developing product and I was trying to learn the product at the same time that they were developing. And that worked out pretty good. Mm-hmm. But that was a completely different industry, which was not the Bonneville Power Administration. So it works elsewhere.
Yeah, thanks for the comment. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, I think that wraps up our lecture today. So thanks to all for joining. We'll post this soon on LinkedIn and Google Drive. Thank you so much.
Sounds very
Joao.
good. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, you too. Bye-bye.
Thank you.